Buenas noches a toda nuestra comunidad académica del programa de negocios internacionales, empresarios, ponentes, egresados, invitados especiales, docentes y comunidad académica administrativa en general, reciban un saludo especial. Damos la bienvenida a las directivas académicas que nos acompañan el día de hoy, al doctor Juan Carlos Cadavid Botero, el rector de la Fundación Universitaria San Mateo, al doctor Gerardo Santos, decano de la Facultad de Contaduría y Finanzas Internacionales de la Fundación Universitaria Compensar. Asimismo, damos la bienvenida al doctor Emiro Romero Arias de la Fundación Universitaria Compensar. Damos también la bienvenida al doctor Carlos González en representación del Tecnológico de Antioquia, al doctor Sebastián Galindo, cantor, socio de OPTA y miembro fundador de FIDA. Asimismo, damos la bienvenida al doctor Víctor Hugo Juárez en representación de la Universidad ETSI de Colombia. Damos también la más cordial bienvenida a nuestro invitado especial, el doctor Simon Leys, profesor titular de Comercio Internacional de la Universidad de Adelaide en Australia. Asimismo, damos una más cordial bienvenida a todos nuestros espectadores que nos siguen en el canal institucional de YouTube, a las instituciones y redes académicas aliadas, a la Universidad Unilatina, Uniciencia, Uniagraria, a la Red de Programas de Negocios Internacionales y Afines de Colombia y, por supuesto, a toda la comunidad de empresarios que se han unido en este quinto Foro Internacional de Derecho Aduanero. A todos ustedes, bienvenidos, y a continuación daré lectura de la agenda programada para esta jornada. Dentro del orden del día vamos a tener 10 puntos. El primero de ellos, el himno nacional de la República de Colombia. Punto 2, palabras del doctor Juan Carlos Cadavid Botero, rector de la Fundación Universitaria San Mateo. Tercer punto, palabras del doctor Sebastián Galindo Cantor, socio de OPTA y miembro fundador de FIDA. Cuarto, palabras del doctor Emiro Romero Arias en representación de la Fundación Universitaria Compensar. Quinto, palabras del doctor Víctor Hugo Juárez en representación de la Universidad ETSI. Sexto, palabra del doctor Carlos Alberto González en representación del Tecnológico de Antioquia. Séptimo, un contexto de FIDA. Octavo, conferencia Desafíos en el Comercio y la Inversión en la Economía Digital a cargo del doctor Simon Leys de la Universidad Adelaide en Australia. Vamos a tener un cierre y reconocimientos. A continuación, para dar apertura a este encuentro, vamos a desarrollo de nuestra agenda. En el primer punto, himno nacional de la República de Colombia. Palabras del doctor Juan Carlos Cadaví Botero, rector de la Fundación Universitaria San Mateo.
Apreciados directivos, ponentes, empresarios, docentes e investigadores, estudiantes y asistentes al quinto Foro Internacional de Derecho Aduanero FIDA 2022. Es para mí un honor, como rector de la Fundación Universitaria San Mateo, y en nombre de los miembros del Consejo Superior, nuestro presidente, el doctor Carlos Orlando Ferreira Pinzón, y del doctor Rodrigo Ferreira Pinzón, miembro de la Asamblea y del Consejo Superior con funciones académicas y administrativas, un saludo fraternal. Igualmente, presento a todas las autoridades académicas un saludo de afecto y respeto, aunado a la bienvenida en este acto de apertura a este importante evento que hoy nos convoca. Nuevamente hoy, después de que nuestro país, y todos lo sabemos, el mundo, estuvo y está atravesando y viviendo situaciones muy complejas, agravadas obviamente por una situación que todos conocemos, la pandemia. En este evento nos reencontramos para celebrar FIDA 2022, un espacio que nos une cada vez más con mayor ahínco. En esta ocasión, para reflexionar y discutir sobre una visión estratégica de los negocios desde la perspectiva tributaria, aduanera y cambiaria, como resultado del conocimiento que generamos en el seno de nuestra alma mater y otras instituciones de educación superior en la región para el reconocimiento del quehacer investigativo. En este encuentro nos servirá para intercambiar ideas y vamos a repensar estratégicamente el desarrollo de los negocios y obviamente también de las operaciones de comercio exterior de nuestro país. Operaciones que actualmente enfrentan un ambiente turbulento, ligadas a los retos del régimen sancionatorio aduanero y a las medidas de defensa comercial y restricciones aduaneras. Hoy, sabemos que los continuos cambios de la normatividad aduanera, cambiaria y tributaria de nuestro país afecta el desarrollo del comercio y de los negocios. Y es aquí donde deriva la importancia y el papel que juega la universidad en la formación del recurso humano, el fomento de la investigación y la producción de conocimiento científicamente válido y empresarialmente pertinente. En la quinta versión de FIDA de 2022, hemos tenido la oportunidad de convocar a expertos provenientes de Australia, a quien presento un saludo cordial, a Ecuador, un abrazo fraternal, a Chile, un saludo cordial, Países Bajos, Perú y por supuesto Colombia, reafirmando sólidas relaciones interinstitucionales, la cual esperamos mantener en futuras oportunidades. En esta ocasión, asistiremos a un programa de trabajo en el que cada espacio de disertación presentará diversas aportaciones para ampliar el espectro de la disciplina de los negocios internacionales y el comercio exterior e internacional, que a partir de un enfoque interdisciplinar busca la apropiación de nuevas propuestas y soluciones frente a las operaciones de comercio de nuestro país. Las intervenciones previstas en esta edición visibilizan el papel que tenemos nosotros desde la academia, de propiciar escenarios de apropiación científica del conocimiento, en compañía de expertos nacionales e internacionales, quienes nos compartirán sus experiencias y posturas en estos 3 días. Nuestro reconocimiento por ello a los conferenciantes y ponentes, que con espíritu de total colaboración van a participar con la finalidad de aumentar la conciencia de ser parte de una comunidad que puede contribuir y consolidar los aportes a magnos propósitos de armonía con nuestra sociedad. También debemos reconocer la labor de todas aquellas personas e instituciones que con su esfuerzo y apoyo han hecho posible la celebración de este foro internacional, a la doctora Ciris María López Rodríguez, directora del Programa de Negocios Internacionales de nuestra Fundación Universitaria San Mateo, junto con la doctora Elizabeth Araquelaica, decana de nuestra Facultad de Ciencias Sociales y Administrativas de la Universitaria San Mateo, y a las instituciones de educación superior hermanas, como la Fundación Universitaria Compensar, la Universidad EXI y la Institución Tecnológico de Antioquia, que atendieron la participación como organizadores en esta quinta edición. Asimismo, agradecemos a todos los que nos han acompañado como otros socios, emprendedores de esta propuesta, a Uniciencia, Uniagraria, al presidente de Renicol, al doctor José Albán, a quien presento de manera cordial un saludo fraternal. Y por supuesto, al sector productivo que se une a estos espacios de disertaciones académicas. Gracias por el apoyo recibido por parte de la OCTA, al doctor Sebastián Galindo, cantor, socio y miembro fundador de FIDA, a Saberes, al doctor Tomás Barreto, gracias a Analdés, el doctor Juan Diego Cano, gracias a Araujo Ibarra Consultores Internacionales, al doctor Juan David Barbosa y a todos los empresarios que se unieron y quién son ellos, quienes nos han permitido crear sinergias para obtener una agenda amplia y diversa en torno a los negocios internacionales. Esperamos sea de gran aporte para cada uno de ustedes. Expreso finalmente mi gratitud a los distintos comités que han procurado la realización del encuentro y a todos los participantes en el mismo, agradeciendo su asistencia. Permítanme entonces que declare inaugurado el quinto Foro Internacional de Derecho Aduanero FIDA 2022. A todos los asistentes, muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, señor rector, el doctor Juan Carlos Cadavid Botero. A continuación, invitamos al doctor Sebastián Galindo Cantor, socio de OCTA y miembro fundador de FIDA.
Muchísimas gracias a todos por participar, a nuestros ponentes nacionales e internacionales que nos acompañan el día de hoy, por esta oportunidad y de seguir creando conocimiento en base a estos temas aduaneros de comercio exterior y demás que han marcado el FIDA desde su creación desde el tema del COVID. Entonces, a todos bienvenidos y esperemos que disfrutemos estos espacios de disertación académica. Gracias, Silvia.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Sebastián. Damos paso al doctor Emiro Romero Arias en representación de la Fundación Universitaria Compensar.
Muchas gracias, Iris y demás compañeros de mesa. Un agradecimiento muy especial a todas las universidades que nos hemos reunido para llevar adelante este Foro Internacional de Derecho Aduanero con la intención de conocer qué ha pasado y cuáles son las nuevas dinámicas frente a diferentes temas en términos de la legislación aduanera y de acuerdo pues a los lineamientos de la Organización Mundial del Comercio y de Aduanas. Y esta noche pues un agradecimiento especial al señor Simon, el cual pues vamos a hablar de un tema muy importante acerca de los desafíos en el comercio y la inversión en la economía digital. Ese reto que en Latinoamérica viven algunos países de una situación un poco más tranquila porque tienen un proceso más avanzado frente al tema de las TIC y otros países que muchas veces están en desventaja. Entonces, pues seguramente nos contará que al poder tener una nivelación en estas oportunidades, facilitaremos todo lo que tiene que ver con la inversión, el crecimiento y la productividad de los negocios en los países que la conforman. Muchísimas gracias, Iris, a todos y bienvenidos al foro.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Emiro. Y es así también como damos paso al doctor Víctor Hugo Juárez en representación de la Universidad ETSI.
Bueno, ante todo, feliz noche. En nombre del rector Fernando Soler de la Universidad ETSI, extendemos un cordial saludo a las distintas universidades presentes en el desarrollo del actual foro de actualización aduanera. Creemos que este es un espacio el cual nos va a permitir fortalecer esos mecanismos de disertación y de debate en torno a el diseño de política pública desde la academia. Y eso es muy importante tenerlo porque va a cobrar gran importancia en el marco del proceso de reactivación económica que está a la espera de muchos países de América Latina, de la región, muchos espacios de integración regional y de igual forma también distintos países en diferentes áreas de influencia. En este sentido, extendemos un cordial saludo a los invitados especiales. Queremos hacer también una mención muy puntual, extenderle el agradecimiento al profesor Simon. Mr. Simon, thank you for being here. Vamos a tener la posibilidad de continuar el desarrollo de este intercambio de experiencia. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos a este foro y este espacio de intercambio de formación pedagógica.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Víctor, y damos paso al doctor Carlos Hernán González en representación del Tecnológico de Antioquia.
Muy buenas noches a todos, muy buenas noches a los organizadores, a los ponentes, a los asistentes, a las demás instituciones. En nombre del decano José Alvaro Londoño, extendemos la bienvenida a este evento y también damos las gracias a Ciris, a la doctora Ciris y demás por la invitación que nos extendió a participar en este evento tan importante. La Facultad y el Tecnológico de Antioquia siempre celebra ese tipo de iniciativas, apoya ese tipo de iniciativas en procura de divulgar el conocimiento y generar nuevo conocimiento en nuestras áreas de acción. Muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, doctor Carlos. Y bueno, y es así, sin más preámbulo, vamos a dar paso a este segundo momento en el cual nos acompañará con la conferencia Desafíos en el Comercio y la Inversión en la Economía Digital, para la cual quiero dar paso al doctor Sebastián Galindo Cantor. Adelante, tiene usted la palabra.
Gracias, Iris. So, good morning, everyone. Well, good night here in Colombia. Good morning, everyone in Australia. Good morning, Mr. Simon. Welcome to Bogota, Colombia in a very different way. Hopefully, in the next sessions, we are going to be here. Thanks for accepting our invitation to be part of this international summit that we're going to study, like the new challenge that we have in international trade and trade law. Well, this is the first session of our event. It's going to be 3-day sessions with the different panelists from around the world, from Australia, from Netherlands, from Peru, from Ecuador, talking about the same topic and how about the new business are going to run out. But well, let's start. Like, we're going to, in this first session, we're going to talk about digital economy and investment and international trade. Well, when we talk about digital economy, well, we have many things. It's like we start to think about digital economy more like than 5 years ago, but I think that the COVID is the disruptive issue that start to make the difference, yeah? And data is start to play an important issue from the last 3 years. Two countries, if we want to understand more about that, we can say that two countries stand out as the front runners in inheriting the value of data. In that case, we're talking about the United States of China, talking about that they have the highest rate of 5G adoption in the world, and they have like the more production in that kind of issues. In that sense, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Simon Lacy. He is in Australia right now, and I want to make like a brief introduction of his biography. Simon is currently a senior lecturer in international trade at the University of Adelaide School of Economics and Public Policy. Prior to that, Simon served as a vice president, trade facilitation and market access at Huawei Technologies in Shenzhen, China, where he was responsible for the monitoring, managing, and mitigating the biggest trade and investment risk facing the company across dozens of its most important markets internationally. Simon has worked in government advisory and policy advocacy roles in more than 30 countries, supporting both sovereigns and corporates. It was in this capacity that Simon spent 4 years in Jakarta advising the Indonesian government and a broad range of issues in connection with the countries member of ASEAN, the WTO, and various preferential trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. Simon obtained his bachelor in laws from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland and LLM from the Georgetown University in Law Center in Washington, D.C., and he's currently completing a PhD in International Economic Law and UNSW Law University in Australia. So good morning, Mr. Simon. It's a pleasure to have you here, and welcome to Colombia, and welcome to this event in South America.
Great. Thanks for that, Sebastian, and thanks for the introduction and the invitation. So let me just share my screen now, if I can. I've just got a presentation that I've prepared here, and I will get started with that. So just to give you some background on how I sort of came to this field, I was a visiting fellow at the University of Georgetown Law Center, as Sebastian mentioned, in 2011. And I was also doing an LLM there, and I came across a white paper that had been written by Google, talking about restrictions on online content and whether that represented a trade barrier. And particularly, it was talking about censorship and other issues in international. Other restrictions that it was facing in its business model, and that other big US technology companies were facing in their online business models in a number of big markets, including China, including the EU, including Turkey. And I read that white paper, and it really sort of turned on a light bulb for me, and that's when I really sort of became very interested in this issue, and I wrote a paper while I was at Georgetown and started attending meetings of business groups in Washington, D.C. And then several years later, I was recruited by Huawei Technologies in China to join their team, their trade team embedded within their public affairs and communications department, helping to manage a lot of sort of trade and investment barriers that the firm was facing. So this is just a brief lecture on the challenges to trade and investment in the digital economy. As Sebastian mentioned, my name is Simon Lacey. I teach international trade at the University of Adelaide. And this is a relatively short lecture of about 15 slides or so. Should only last about 30 minutes, where I discuss some of the biggest trade and investment issues, particularly restrictions facing big actors in the digital economy. So let me start by just sort of giving you an overview. This is essentially a lecture in 5 parts. We're going to start by sort of defining the digital economy, at least for the purpose of the subjects addressed in this lecture. Then we're going to move on to briefly discuss what objectives and approaches governments pursue and implement when regulating or attempting to regulate different aspects of the digital economy. And it's very important to understand this, because this is really what leads to the imposition of a lot of these restrictions. Then we move on to discuss 3 broadly defined visions of internet governance, which conflict with each other in important ways. And it's these conflicts or tensions that give rise to many of the challenges faced with respect to trade and investment in the digital economy today. And then finally, I conclude by discussing my views on the future outlook and prospects for both trade and investment challenges, but also for the digital economy more broadly. So let me just begin. So here, this is based on some work that I did when I was at Huawei Technologies. One of the first things they asked me to do when I joined the company was to do a bit of a mapping exercise and produce a company white paper that helped the company to articulate its positions or its position with respect to a number of new trade rules that were being negotiated at that time to govern trade and investment in the digital economy. So at that time, we were talking about the transatlantic trade and investment partnership that was going on between the US and the EU that was being negotiated at the time. This was all pre-Trump. This was sort of the end of the Obama administration. And then there was the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was being negotiated at that time. And then there was also the Trade in Services Agreement at the WTO. And all of these agreements were attempting to define new rules on trade in the digital economy. And my job when I joined Huawei, the first thing they asked me to do was elaborate, first define and articulate some of the company's positions on different aspects of these rules. And so I led the writing, the production of a white paper on trade rules for the digital economy for Huawei, and some of this work, this slide in particular, is based on some of the findings that we made during those efforts. So here we try and define the digital economy, and in doing so, it's important to recall that trying to distinguish between the digital and the non-digital economies is becoming increasingly an increasingly difficult undertaking, since they're rapidly converging to simply just become the economy, right? So today we don't talk about the electrical and the non-electrical economy, whereas 100 years ago or a little bit earlier, you might have actually done that. There were parts of the economy that were electrified, there were others that weren't. And so really the digital and non-digital economies are really just converging to become the economy. And it's important to keep that in mind as we think about these issues. So here we really just identify 4 different layers, if you like, of the digital economy. And we talk about, what they are and who are the main actors in these different sectors of the economy. It's very important to understand who, because it's the who and their interests, particularly their monetary interests. In the field of international trade, if you want to understand why something is happening, just always follow the money. So you've got to find out who is behind certain layers of the digital economy in order to be able to extrapolate their interests and what they're trying to achieve from a regulatory and policy perspective. So the first layer is infrastructure. And this includes sort of optical fiber, cables, switches, signal amplifiers, servers, data centers, even satellites, wireless base stations, mobile telephone towers, all of this sort of hard and physical part of the digital economy. And if you're looking at, who are the actors in that space, it's dominated by sort of a small handful of large players that can offer comprehensive solutions in terms of building and operating these networks, particularly providing the equipment for these networks. But there are also thousands of smaller players making, discrete parts of these networks, such as antennas or software interfaces. Then the second layer are the network services themselves. So that's online connectivity. But there are also thousands of other kinds of services that are provided over the top of these networks. In fact, the most monumental struggles that we've seen over how to regulate the internet over the last 2 decades has really been about how to price and otherwise manage access to these networks, to manage access to the online connectivity. So the question is, should access be priced like a utility with the same prices for essentially all users, and with users afforded equal access in the form of universal service obligations? So that's what the over-the-top service providers want, because it makes it easier and cheaper to access the value or the functionality that they provide. Or should market access be allowed should market forces be allowed to dictate who can access the network and under what terms and conditions, particularly how much they can be compelled to pay? So this is what those who own and operate the networks want, the telcos, because they are deeply aggrieved with what they see as the injustice of them being the ones who ultimately bear the burden of the massive capital expenditures and operating costs of building and maintaining these networks entail, while the over-the-top actors reap the greatest rewards and earn sort of windfall profits off the new and innovative data-driven business models that the underlying network connectivity enables. So in terms of who operates in this space, we usually find a small number, 2 or 3 large network providers, usually operating at a national level, in some cases operating across many different markets. Then there are the many smaller internet service providers, the ISPs, that lease access to these networks at wholesale rates and then sell that access to retail customers at a markup. And then in terms of the over-the-top players, the OTT actors, there are literally hundreds of thousands, ranging from the very big like Facebook, Uber, Spotify, to the very small companies that only operate in a small geographical market. The third layer is what I call platforms. These can also be thought of as ecosystems. A lot of the over-the-top OTT actors are actually ecosystem providers or platform providers. And this is the result of being able to connect to online services across multiple devices and being able to access the same functionality. Or it can also happen when a single provider offers such a comprehensive range of services that there's almost no need to go outside the ecosystem for any online need that you may have, whether it's listening to music, watching a movie, playing a game, hailing a ride, ordering food, making a financial payment. For online or offline services, you can do it all from atop the same platform or from within the same ecosystem. So Google is an ecosystem. It functions across multiple devices and offers a very wide range of solutions and applications spanning your mobile, your desktop or your laptop, to your home appliances. Apple is another ecosystem platform, but there are others. Alibaba is a huge platform. Shopify has a whole range of services that it offers. Amazon Web Services is a platform. So there are many examples. Facebook is a platform. Probably the most comprehensive, all-encompassing platform is WeChat. So once you're on WeChat in China, you never really need to leave WeChat. You can do everything within WeChat. And then fourth, these are the physical terminals by which we access online connectivity. This is what connects the user, you and me, to all of this online functionality. So these were traditionally desktops or laptops. And then after 2007, when the iPhone was introduced, this increasingly came to be smartphones and wearables. And these terminals, these wearables and these smartphones, they're different in that they not only provide us with access to all this online functionality, but increasingly they collect and share massive amounts of data about us, the user. And with sensors and cameras increasingly being embedded into everything and being connected to artificial intelligence in the cloud, we're quickly heading towards a world characterized by the Internet of Everything, IoE. So here we have a handful of smaller players active across a wide range of complementary devices, but all sort of larger players active across a wide range of complementary devices. So you've got Apple, you've got Huawei, again, you've got Google, you've got Microsoft, but also smaller specialized companies that focus on producing one item or product in this category, like sensors or cameras, And so that's the who of that particular space. So the future really belongs to those who can make as many of these devices that users want and connect them seamlessly with the ecosystems and platforms that they either own or control. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of defining the digital economy. So moving on now to how governments have sought to regulate the digital economy and the objectives they pursue when doing so. So here we can see a number of objectives that governments pursue. And this list is by no means meant to be exhaustive. It was the Clinton administration back in the 90s who perhaps first glimpsed the sort of game-changing potential of the internet as a general purpose technology. However, since then, online connectivity and digital technologies have come to be viewed as something of a panacea by many governments for tackling a whole range of policy objectives. And here I've listed a few. So we have reducing the size of the informal economy. In many developing countries, the informal sector massively overshadows the formal sector. And by digitizing, moving everything online, payments, payrolling systems, you can reduce the size of the informal sector, and government's very interested in doing that because it increases their tax base. Improving the delivery of government services is another one, moving government services online. There, China really sort of leads the way, but also in countries like Australia, it's really possible to pretty much do anything you want to do except vote online. And then another one is diversifying the economy. So a lot of countries, particularly those heavily based on hydrocarbons. So we see this in places like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, very interested in promoting the digital economy in order to diversify their economic bases. And of course, there are many others. And so these different objectives ultimately lead to different regulatory approaches that governments have taken. So light touch, laissez-faire approach was first strongly advocated by the Clinton administration, and which many governments essentially followed in Europe, in Asia, because this approach was championed by the US government at the time at intergovernmental fora like the OECD and APEC, but also the US really championed this regulatory approach in the EU in the second half of the 90s. But other approaches include things like regulatory sandboxes or experimentation, which means allowing new and innovative approaches or business models to operate in a highly regulated sector on a trial basis or in a limited geographic area or jurisdiction. This is how M-Pesa got started in Kenya. It was rolled out. It's an electronic mobile payments platform, and it was rolled out on a trial basis by the financial regulator, and it proved so popular that it was then just adopted permanently. And then a lot of other governments do this sort of regulatory sandboxing or experimentation with other technologies. China is a big fan of this. So that just is an overview of the different regulatory objectives and the different kind of regulatory approaches that governments take in regulating the internet. And it's this diversity of approaches which essentially leads to what I'm going to talk about next, which is competing or diverging visions of internet governance. So, of course, there are more than simply sort of three competing visions of internet governance, but here I've sort of taken the liberty of defining three overarching categories for the sake of simplicity. So the first is what I refer to as this is the first approach, the Internet of Business. This was first and continues today to largely be championed and espoused by the US. And you know, in doing this, the US is essentially championing its own corporate interests. And the second approach is what I like to call the Internet of Values. So this vision sees the internet as a platform for promoting a whole range of values such as rule of law, human rights, but also things like cultural diversity. Also sees the value of regulating the internet where it undermines these values. And this is essentially the vision of the European Union, as well as other liberal democracies such as Australia, South Korea, and others. The third vision sees the value of the internet as an effective tool for strengthening the hand of the state and for promoting stability, law and order. So this is the command and control vision of the internet. And this is shared by many states such as China, Russia, a number of countries in the Middle East, but also the national security hawks in Washington, DC, the NSA, etc. They really see the internet as a tool of command and control as well. Okay, so those differing visions of internet governance really have a whole range of implications for trade and investment. And in the next slide, we're going to discuss those. So these competing visions of internet governance have ultimately conspired to generate a number of legislative and regulatory outcomes, the ultimate consequence of which is to cause greater fragmentation, making cross-border business models more complex and costly, and thus further entrenching the position of bigger and more sophisticated players who can engage in sort of regulatory arbitrage across different markets and who have the resources to be able to adapt their business model to do business on different geographic markets and according to different regulatory models. Smaller players have a lot more difficulty in doing that. So here I list a few examples, some of which are already going to be more than familiar to you. So the lack of interoperability between different privacy regimes is a big problem and should have been a totally avoidable outcome, given that we've had some very sound and sort of high functioning intergovernmental processes that have been addressing the issue of data privacy in the modern internet economy for decades now, such as the OECD and at APEC. And both of these have produced a set of operating principles that should have allowed us to avoid some of the outcomes we have today. So the OECD is primarily made up of members of the European Union. APEC brings China, the US, Russia to the table. So these fora should have allowed us to avoid some of the outcomes we have today, with vastly different and seemingly incompatible privacy regimes between some of the largest data markets or ecosystems such as the US, the EU and China. And this is essentially a failure of governments to agree to be constrained in their domestic legislative and regulatory rulemaking or interventions in accordance with the kinds of principles hashed out at the OECD and APEC. And as a result of this, we have various forms of restrictions on the movement of data across borders, some of which are very sensible and do promote and protect privacy, but some of which are sort of excessively strict and severely undermine online business models. Local content requirements are a kind of trade restrictive measure that have been around for decades, but also used extensively in high-tech industries, those industries that underpin the digital economy, and are a way for countries to sort of artificially climb up the value chain and encourage or compel local production of more and more value-added manufacturing. So Indonesia uses this to great effect to compel Samsung and Apple to locate various assets in the country. Brazil has tried to do the same in consumer technologies. India has its famous Make in India. But of course, it's not just developing countries that try their hand at this. Many of the rules of origin in FTAs are formulated in a way that they have a similar effect to local content requirements by artificially distorting value chains. And of course, the techno-nationalism that we've seen re-emerge in the last decade or so has produced similar effects. I'm not going to discuss all of these, just highlight 2 or 3 of them. The last one I'll talk about is investment screening mechanisms. So we've seen developed countries in particular erecting discriminatory barriers to safeguard their domestic technology interests against being acquired by China. Very good. So just going to finish up now with some of my own views on what the outlook and future prospects are for trade and investment in the digital economy. So I think the most important thing to come to terms with is that geopolitical tensions are here to stay. So geopolitical tensions between large powers, established, emerging, and resurgent, is really something that's not going away anytime soon. So this means we need to find ways of managing these tensions constructively rather than just sort of wishing them away or striving for a world where they no longer exist. So the US is, of course, the established hegemon. And although it's easy to accuse the US of hypocrisy and double standards, it's also true that the US has long sought to establish an order based on relatively equal access to all, or for all, to markets and economic opportunities. And this is something that sort of goes back to the open door policy of the late 19th, early 20th century, which tried to forestall sort of an uncoordinated land grab by competing colonial powers of China. But it was also reflected in the establishment of the rules-based multilateral trading system following the Second World War. And so likewise, today, the US continues to champion an open and free digital economy with any restrictions on market access or discriminatory treatment of foreign interests, limited only to what is strictly necessary in order to achieve a small number of high-order policy priorities such as national security. And just like in the era of the open door policy and after the Second World War, the US advocates this position out of a sort of mix of high-minded idealism, but also because it plays to its own strengths as the dominant actor with the most powerful firms in the modern digital economy. Emerging powers in this context are, of course, China, which also has some very powerful firms in the digital economy, and which has much bigger aggregations of that vital commodity that underpins so much value creation in the digital economy, namely data. Of course, China is challenging US preeminence not only in the digital economy, but across a whole range of areas, including sort of regional military superiority and political and economic governance models. And in terms of resurgent powers, I would name the European Union here, which is starting to take on increasing significance in the digital economy as a source of regulation, which tries to balance sort of competing interests and achieve outcomes that seek to offset power asymmetries or imbalances between the biggest players in the internet economy and users and smaller players. The second thing I mentioned here are autarkic strategies in advanced technologies will limit international cooperation. So, we've just seen sort of 3 decades of unfettered sort of globalization built on the Washington Consensus. I wouldn't say that's over, but I think that's going to be tempered somewhat in the future. So autarkic strategies means the tendency for governments to foster self-sufficiency or reduce reliance on foreign markets for key components or inputs that are essential for the functioning of their economies. So the big area where this is playing out now is in semiconductors, but also in the software and cyber security spaces. We're seeing countries like China and the US, as well as India, increasingly promoting national champions and seeking to limit penetration in their own markets by foreign providers. So this inevitably limits international cooperation, and it's a net negative for innovation, since the open innovation model that firms have pursued for about 2 decades or more now is contingent on knowledge and information flowing freely across borders. And then the third point I mentioned there is that continued international cooperation and economic integration will ultimately trump calls for decoupling. So we've seen, however, despite calls by some for widespread decoupling, my belief is this is unlikely to extend beyond a small number of core technologies, simply because the underlying dynamics and imperatives that have driven globalization and the profits that this has brought for companies, as well as the welfare enhancements that this has brought for populations around the world, are simply too self-evident and too compelling for anyone to accept any kind of general and wide-scale rollback of globalization, unless it's limited to a small number of products and is merely temporary. And so, you know, if you look at what we're seeing play out between the US and China, a lot of that is just political grandstanding. You know, if you really look sort of behind the headlines, you'll see that, you know, big US tech companies are not in a hurry to leave the Chinese market, simply too big, too valuable. You know, just last week we had stories coming out of Shanghai, whereby big US banks like Goldman Sachs are actually relocating people to Shanghai despite the lockdowns and the pandemic there. So big tech and big capital just not at all interested in leaving the China market at all. It's just too big and too profitable. And that's why I think that the ultimate effects of decoupling are going to be limited. So that's really all from me. I'll say thank you again for the invitation. It's always great to speak in another part of the world, this time in Latin America, and really happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Simon, for your presentation. Like, it was very insightful ideas of how digital economy it's arrived to be here and stay here for the next future. Well, we could talk about like many of your conclusions about geopolitical, yeah, and taking about that geopolitical conclusion that you have talked about. We have a question here from the University of Exi. And they want to know what could be the impact on digital economy about this situation that is happening right now in Europe about Russia invasion to Ukraine. Like, it's going to be change something, or how it's going to be affect that development that we have already, and you talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the impact that we're seeing of the conflict in Ukraine, you know, initiated by Russia, is really sort of playing out in the real economy, in commodities like gas, oil, but also potentially wheat. And we're really sort of predicting that this is going to have very negative flow-on effects in certain commodities and in the real economy. In the digital economy, you know, I would argue that Russia wasn't really that integrated into the global digital economy. It sort of had its own ecosystem. From a cybersecurity perspective, you know, experts had recognized that Russia just wasn't a reliable partner, and so Russian firms were really have been shunned by Western markets. Russian digital firms have been shunned by Western markets for several years now. So I don't really see the impact on the digital economy. The one thing to remember, though, is that in the research and innovation space, Russia does have some really unique capabilities. You know, people think about Russia just being a great place for cyber hacking, but actually, you know, Russia has some of the best mathematical minds in the world, and so has produced some really amazing breakthroughs in terms of things like algorithms for moving network traffic across digital networks and that sort of thing. So there will be an impact, I think, on innovation over the medium to long term if we lose access to all of that Russian know-how and expertise. But just in the short to medium term, I think the impact on the digital economy will be minimal. But of course, the impact on the global economy is going to be considerable. And we've seen a lot of big organizations like the IMF, like the WTO, recalibrate their growth predictions for the global economy and for trade growth in 2022 significantly downwards as a result of the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay, thanks very much. Here we have an question from an international trade lawyer. It said that, what's your opinion on the current job of the UN Statistics Officing regarding knowledge-based services? I ask this because the effects of COVID on international trade delayed the global codification as the custom HS.
Yeah, look, I don't really have an answer to that. I'm not really sure what that question is addressing. So I'll just skip that. Sorry about that.
Okay, no problem. Here we have other questions. 1 second. Regarding all the different questions that we received from the public. The request, if you can give a brief explanation when you talk about the investment restrictions that you was talking about, if you could get us a brief or more ideas about that.
Sure. Okay, so the thing to understand about investment is that for many decades, developed countries in particular had been pushing sort of an open investment environment and a foreigner-friendly investment environment in developing countries, and had also liberalized, their own investment regimes considerably. I think Europe sort of led the way at this. In the US, you still had some safeguards in place in the form of CFIUS. But in 2016, the largest foreign investor, or the largest source of foreign investment outflows in the world, was China, and you had all of this Chinese capital flooding into the US and flooding into Europe, especially, so snapping up strategic assets like the power grid in Portugal, or technology companies like KUKA in Germany, and that really sort of started to scare regulators in these markets. And also, it sort of really a light sort of went off that there wasn't necessarily reciprocal access to strategic investments and high-tech investments in the Chinese market for European and US firms and for Western firms or foreign firms in general. And so there needed to be sort of a correction, a recalibration of investment regimes. And the Germans started this by raising the minimum equity acquisition threshold for which a mandatory security review was required. And at the same time, if you read or if you watch the State of the Union address by the president of the Commission at the time, of the EU Commission, he goes on record as saying that there has to be some sort of adjustment of the EU investment regime, and at that point the EU also started to think about and implement a scheme for sort of screening foreign investment into the EU at the member state level, and encouraging member states to set up a national investment screening mechanism, just to sort of allay the fears of some that China was sort of trying to buy up strategic assets and technology companies in Western markets, and thereby procure the knowledge and expertise and know-how that these companies had.
Okay, we have another question here. Give me 1 second. Well, what will be like the impact of digital economy on regional integration? We hear that Asia have a good, we're working in this kind of issue about digital economy and trade and services. Yeah, how do you see that in the future, and how it's going to change the way that we are going to sign the new FTAs in the future?
Yeah, look, I think different regions are moving ahead at different speeds, right? And so there's a couple of things to say there. I mean, we've sort of been talking about the implications of e-commerce on international trade rules of the WTO since 1998 without really kind of getting anywhere. And that sort of changed in 2019 when they launched negotiations on trade-related aspects of e-commerce, and we're sort of we're predicting that an agreement might come out of the WTO on a number of limited issues affecting digital trade or e-commerce, cross-border trade and e-commerce, maybe this year, maybe next year, sometime soon. But where we've had sort of gridlock or deadlock at the WTO, the place for innovation in terms of new rules, new trade rules, has been regional trade agreements or preferential trade agreements. And so the US, ever since its FTA with Jordan, has insisted on having trade rules on e-commerce in its FTAs, and they've gradually expanded to take on whole chapters. So Chorus, the Korea-US FTA, was an example where they had a whole chapter on e-commerce, but it was non-binding. And then the TPP was sort of the first agreement where the US negotiators really pushed a fairly comprehensive set of rules on e-commerce digital trade, and it had to be binding. And of course, the US pulled out of the TPP, but that chapter is sort of still there in the CPTPP and still binding. So preferential trade agreements or regional trade agreements is where we've seen a lot of innovation, and the USMCA probably has one of the most far-reaching digital trade chapters of any FTA negotiated to date. And in other regions, we've seen these chapters sort of embraced with varying levels of enthusiasm. You know, a lot of countries in Asia are quite skeptical about you know, giving tax-free treatment to electronic cross-border electronic transmissions, and you know, giving as much regulatory freedom of action to digital firms as possible. A lot of Asian governments are a bit skeptical about that approach. And so you're seeing different levels of enthusiasm in adopting digital trade chapters or digital trade rules in FTAs in different regions.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, we have like at least two more questions, and one is from your point of view and your knowledge, what will be your advice for the Latin America and how to get approach to this digital economy? What is the best way, or how we can improve our knowledge about this new reality?
Yeah, I think, you know, Latin America suffers from a lot of the sort of same constraints that Australia does. You know, I mean, relatively geographically isolated, and you know, in our case, it's geography. In the case of South America, it's sort of underdeveloped international trade transport infrastructure. And domestic transport infrastructure. And so, you know, the digital economy, the promise of the digital economy is really to sort of overcome the tyranny of distance. And that's why I think Australia has so embraced digital technologies, because the tyranny of distance, Australia for you know, most of its history was very far removed geographically from its biggest markets, which were in Europe, I mean the UK particularly. And it's only been in sort of the last decades that we've overcome that and developed new markets in our region. But even there, we're still, you know, geographically quite distant from those markets. And the promise of the digital economy was to overcome the tyranny of distance. And I think in Latin America, it's the same sort of promise. But you know, you have to sort of adopt. There are a few things that sort of need to fall into place in order to make that work. So first of all is making access to online connectivity as cheap, as ubiquitous, and as easy as possible for as much of the population as possible. And then, you know, helping populations to get connected, but then also to develop digital skills, and just to enact policies that promote online digital or business models, or at least don't make online or digital business models any more difficult than offline models. But in a lot of countries in Latin America, you know, there's thick regulation, bureaucratic red tape, and for the offline economy, and just making sure that thick red tape and those bureaucratic hurdles are not also imposed on entrepreneurs who want to do business in the digital economy is very important. And so the promise of the digital economy for Latin America is really great. And I think, you know, the way to engage with that is to make sure that, you know, you're engaging in these negotiations at the WTO, but also making sure that any trade agreements that you negotiate, whether it's Mercosur, whether it's the Pacific Alliance, have strong trade rules on digital that are then implemented at the domestic level to make business in the digital economy for entrepreneurs as easy as possible. And then data privacy is, of course, important, and you've got a great set of data privacy rules in the APEC principles. Just implement those at the national level, and you'll have interoperability with many of your biggest data markets. Unfortunately, not the EU, but with many other markets.
Okay, thanks. Well, we have the last one question, like for the time that we have already 5 minutes in order to finish this first session. It's like, okay, we talk about Latin America, but so far the next ministerial I forgot the word,
Meeting,
yeah, it's going to be in June on the WTO. What is, from your point of, what is the main point that they need to like address in order to advance in trade and service and in digital economy?
Yeah, I mean, look, the risk with these ministerial conferences is that they sort of raise expectations for a big breakthrough, and then when they don't produce a big breakthrough, you know, everybody feels disappointed, and then people continue to question, you know, why do we have the WTO? You know, do we even need this organization? So I think for the Director General, for the organization, you know, in general, it's really about managing expectations for this ministerial conference. Yes, you want to have a couple of breakthroughs, but you don't want to promise too much. Now, whether we can get a breakthrough on the trade negotiations going on in e-commerce, that remains to be seen. There's definitely been a lot of consensus. There's been some consensus on some sort of low-hanging fruit, some of the less contentious rules in the e-commerce chapter, but you know, I wouldn't promise results on e-commerce for this ministerial. I think, you know, if we can get a breakthrough on things like fishery subsidies negotiations or something else, then that'll be more than enough. So I wouldn't want to raise expectations that we'll have a breakthrough in the ministerial conference for on e-commerce rules.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, like they have many issues to address right now in this ministerial conference in order to get like in order to negotiate. So it's like around 7:57 at night here. I think it's around 10 in Australia. Thanks. We was from the different universities that we work on that in this event. We want to say thanks very much, Mr. Simon, in order to be here and share with us this brief introduction and your thoughts about digital economic trade and investment.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, well, Ciris, volvemos contigo. I will translate the parole to Mr. Ciris. Ciris? Bueno, entonces, al parecer Ciris tiene problemas de conexión. Entonces, profesor Víctor y profesor Emiro, para el cierre. ¿Me escuchan? Profesor Emilio, ¿tienes?
Gracias, Sebastián. Pues nada, que esto es muy importante, la información que nos acaba de transmitir el profesor Simon, explicándonos sobre todas las estrategias que se debe tener presente al momento de hacer un tema de negociación frente a los temas de de la transformación digital. Muchísimas gracias, Sebastián. Lo que considero que ha sido muy valioso todos los aportes que hemos tenido y muchas gracias a usted también por la gran gestión que ha venido realizando como traductor en este evento. Profesor Víctor, muy buenas noches, lo dejo. Oh, ya llegó la profesora Ciris.
Ah, bueno, sí, bueno, profe, tiene las damas primero, profesora Ciris.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias a nuestro invitado, el doctor Simon. Realmente comparto varios apuntes que mencionaba. Y entre ellas lo que mencionaba frente a esas tensiones geopolíticas que de alguna u otra manera se vienen presentando, no solamente pues lo que ya conocemos entre Estados Unidos y China, sino también esas tensiones geopolíticas que se vienen dando a nivel mundial. Y mencionaba respecto a esa parte de transformación, no solo transformación digital, sino me permitiría mencionar que estamos como en ese punto de transformación del mundo donde realmente hay un nuevo orden económico. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias. Adelante, doctor Víctor, para demás comentarios.
Bueno, en ese sentido, quisiera como destacar varias cosas, ¿no? Nosotros en relaciones internacionales lo llamamos punto de fisura, punto de ruptura. Eso es lo que vive desde, creo que varias perspectivas, el mundo actualmente. En ese sentido, la pandemia marca un antes y un después en el desarrollo y la dinámica de la balanza de poder internacional, y nos plantea un conjunto de temas en los cuales el mismo mundo, los consumidores, los clientes, nos exige grandes desafíos, nos exige grandes oportunidades. En este sentido, yo creo que es importante la necesidad desde las escuelas de negocios internacionales, de relaciones internacionales, de comercio internacional, fortalecer esa mirada integral del mundo. ¿Okay? Como lo decían ustedes perfectamente, identificar cuáles son esos cambios geopolíticos y qué retos nos viene presentando en materia de las nuevas apuestas, del nuevo desarrollo de estrategias económicas basadas en el uso de las tecnologías de la comunicación y la información. El gran reto es aterrizar todo ese análisis desde nosotros en el terreno pedagógico para poder de alguna u otra manera contribuir en estos espacios reflexivos de intercambio de experiencias y que evidentemente nos va a garantizar el desarrollo y el fortalecimiento de este tipo de debates. Creo que la economía digital es una representación de cuál va marcando la tendencia del mundo. Tenemos estos cambios que parecen indetenibles y que no podemos seguir viendo el mundo con los ojos de la Guerra Fría ni de posterior a la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Esto tiene que evidentemente apostarle al desarrollo de nuevos esquemas y conceptos de integración, de colaboración. Esto es un mundo mucho más pragmático que posterior a la Segunda Guerra, que nos dejaba un nuevo orden internacional. En este sentido, considero particularmente que el papel de la educación es un vehículo garantizado para ir fortaleciendo el desarrollo de estos temas que nos va a permitir identificar realmente cuáles son estas oportunidades para abrir nuevos mercados y finalmente promover dos elementos básicos. Es el tema de la internacionalización de nuestro aparato productivo, ya sea pequeña, mediana empresa o grandes empresas, y de alguna otra forma también generar la diversificación económica, que eso evidentemente es un tema que dejo ahí para seguir debatiendo durante el desarrollo de esta jornada. Muchas gracias.
Listo, perfecto. Yo creo que hemos comenzado de manera exitosa y con una reflexión interesante este primer día de FIDA. Y pues no, nos queda nada más invitarlos a las próximas jornadas. Mañana tendremos diferentes charlas y una perspectiva integral de toda operación de comercio exterior. Comenzaremos a las 8 de la mañana con un análisis regional de cuáles son los retos del régimen sancionatorio aduanero y qué significa obviamente la sentencia C441 de la Corte. Posteriormente en la noche tendremos también un análisis muy integral desde la perspectiva obviamente tributaria, cómo los impuestos impactan toda operación de comercio exterior. Y terminaremos con una visión de cómo es necesario hacer una simbiosis entre lo que tiene que ver en operaciones de moneda extranjera y finalmente pues obviamente la parte de análisis aduanero y tributario. Entonces, muchísimas gracias a todos y entonces los esperamos mañana también virtual por Live Teams, hablando un poco de estas reflexiones.